Okay, so we're continuing here in our story on Judaism, and where I ended last class is talking about how the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, where to Moses was given all these instructions. That's what the word Torah literally means, is instruction. And it's held, the rabbis held later on, that there were 613 of these laws or instructions that were given to the people. And they're basically of one of two categories, either religious laws pertaining to how people are to relate to God, various instructions and laws, basically rules, if you like, in terms of how to relate to God. And that, of course, involves, the building of a future temple, which was at first a portable tabernacle. The institution of a priesthood with all kinds of instructions regarding that, various rituals that were to be done, holy days to be kept, and things like that, dietary laws that were kept and followed. Then you have moral laws pertaining to how people are to relate to each other, and of course also to the land, property, animals, etc. And those are the moral laws, and that's kind of where we ended talking about all that last week. Okay, so to continue here, I just want to give you a bit of an idea as to what some of these religious laws were like, highlighting the most important holy day of the year, which is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And so what happens here, this is a bit of a picture of the tabernacle. That is, it functions as a type of temple, if you like, but it's portable. It's something that they carried with them through the desert in the wilderness, where they would construct kind of like if you want to use blankets or animal skins or whatever, that would make up temporary walls that they would string up, as you can see here. And this would be sort of the larger outer courtyard that you could enter into. And there's a place there for the burning of food or animals for sacrifice. Okay, you can see the altar there. And then also for cleansing rituals. Okay, there's a water basin, so to speak. And then the building that you see there, that is called the holy place. Okay, the holy place. And that also was constructed, with the use of tapestry and posts. And you'd go in there, and the first section was the holy place, where you would simply have the candlestick known as the menorah, a 7-branched candlestick. As you can see there, that's number 6. Okay, or by the number 6, or what is it here? Oh, the number 5, it says on the side there. That's the candlestick. You can, hopefully see it. There will be a table. There'll be loaves of bread there. The tradition was 12 loaves of bread to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, this was sort of the holy place. Then, as the number 3 is there that you can see, that was a veil, a tapestry that separated the holy place from the most holy place, or also known as the Holy of Holies. And inside there, you had what's known the Ark of the Covenant, which is a chest-like construction that you could open up. And the tradition is that inside of that, it later on would contain the Moses' staff, okay, kind of a staff rod that he carried, the tablets of the 10 Commandments and things like that inside. Okay, and that's the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. And so for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, this is the most important of all the Jewish holy days, right? The ritual, the focus of it, it's known as the Day of Atonement. That's what Yom Kippur means, the Day of Atonement. And this is the day where all the sins of the people of Israel, their sins would be forgiven by God. And it would involve, first of all, the sacrifice of a bull calf that would be sacrificed to atone for and address the sins of the priests. And the high priest, and only the high priest, would go into the most holy place and sprinkle some of the blood of this animal onto the Ark of the Covenant, seeking God's forgiveness for the sins of the priests. And it was only the high priest, he would only enter the most holy place, okay, or the Holy of Holies, only once a year, and only him, and on the Day of Atonement. All right, it was very much restricted to the high priest to enter there only on the Day of Atonement. Then there were also 2 goats, and one goat would be chosen to be sacrificed, and the sins of that the sins of the people would be placed would be forgiven through the sacrifice of that goat. And the one goat that would still be alive, the sins of the people would be kind of passed on to that goat. So like laying the hands on it and saying, may all the sins of the people of Israel fall upon you. And that goat is sent off into the wilderness, into the desert. Whereas the other one is sacrificed as a sacrifice to God to bring about the forgiveness of sins for all the people of Israel. So one was for the priests, the other one's for the people. Okay. And so it's held that this is the day when the sins of all the people would be forgiven through this ritual. And this is where we get the word scapegoat from. The goat that gets sent out into the desert to carry away the sins of the people is known as the scapegoat, and that's the origin of that word. So this was Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And this is just, again, just to give you a bit of an idea of the layout and structure of what's going to become the holy place in the Jewish tradition. And at first it was portable, something that they packed with them and carried it with them throughout, as they entered into the Sinai Peninsula, into what's often called the wilderness. And later on, the basic directions in terms of the length and width and all that was involved here of the structure of this, the basic structure of it, that will become the building of a permanent temple in the city of Jerusalem down the road, later on under King Solomon. Okay, but at this point, in this early period, it's something that was portable until they build a permanent temple later on. So this is the tabernacle, and just to give you a bit of an idea of how, some of these laws, some of the rituals, so you have a bit of a sense of that. Okay, that all gets here established at Mount Sinai with Moses. Okay, so the story goes is that, for some 40 years, and I need to emphasize that a lot of the numbers used in the Bible are usually more symbolic than actually literal. So that 40 years is usually a rounded up number to represent a generation of time. So they were in this Sinai Peninsula, which is referred to as the wilderness, for about 40 years. And then after Moses' death, the leadership falls upon the figure of Joshua. It was sort of passed on to Joshua from Moses, who then leads the people out of the Sinai Peninsula into what's known as the Land of Canaan, which is believed to be the promised land that was promised to Abraham years earlier, okay, or generations earlier. Generally, the date is given to be around 1200 BC, where the people start to enter into this region, partly sometimes conquering certain sections, other times just sort of moving in because it was rather vacant and kind of, settling in that region. Okay. And so this is where you have the story of the city Jericho, which is often held to be one of the oldest cities of the world that they then had conquered. Is sort of the story about that archaeologists have found the city. There's a lot of archaeologists look to the Bible to find a lot of the cities it referred to, the names of kings and rulers. A lot of the history was so much of it has been verified through archaeological research. So it's very much a historical document. So they're here now in the land of Canaan, right? And in this early period, this is referred to often as the period of the judges. Okay, the period of the judges, where it functioned as a type of a theocracy, where the people were under God's leadership and guidance, who then spoke and led the people through judges. And there's a number of judges that were leaders in this time period. One of them even was a woman, Deborah. And the last of these judges is Samuel. And Samuel also was a prophet. Okay, he also became known as a prophet, somebody who could directly hear the words of God in a rather blatant way, so to speak. So anyways, it's in this context, though, that we find that the people are often in a lot of competition and conflict with the Philistines over this land. And this is where we get the word Palestine from. It's from the Philistines. And these are people that kind of migrated into this area. They were a seafaring people that came by boat across the Mediterranean into this region and started to settle in there. And so there's increasing competition and therefore battle between the Israelites and the Philistines. And so in one of these battles, what happens is the Ark of the Covenant got taken by the Philistines. So what they used to do when the Israelites would go forward into battle, they would carry the Ark of the Covenant ahead of them that was meant to embody, believed to embody the very presence of God and would guarantee their victory in battle. That's sort of the idea here. Okay. And if you've seen the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, that classic movie, it's based on this sort of idea. And it's actually based on some fact and things that Hitler definitely was out to try to get objects that he believed had holy power, spiritual power that could guarantee his victory in various ways. And so the movie is sort of, based on that premise. And anyway, do watch that movie sometime and you'll see, but in that whole movie, they have the ark opening up and then this kind of like spiritual energies coming out and destroying people all around them, right? Well, that's sort of the idea here in a sense. I mean, again, it's Hollywood for you, but the idea is that it had power, spiritual power. So a disaster happens is that they go into battle one day, all right, the Israelites against the Philistines, and they lose, and the Philistines get the Ark of the Covenant. And so the people were really upset about this. So they then go to Samuel and they say, Samuel, we want you to go and talk to God and tell God that we want a king like other people. The reason why, we lost the battle and they now have the ark is because we don't have a king. So they commission Samuel to go and talk to God to have the permission from God to have a king to become their ruler instead of it being, a theocracy. It starts to become a monarchy. Okay. Well, the story goes is that Samuel goes and talks to God and God tells Samuel like, nah, this is not a good idea. People don't want to institute a government and some kind of monarchy. And so God initially says no. And Samuel goes back to the people, tells them that. And the people says, well, we don't like that idea. You go and tell God that we want a king. We demand it. We insist on it. Okay. So Samuel goes back to God and God says, well, all right, if that's what they really want, right? And so then he leads and guides Samuel to choose who's going to become the first king for the Israelites, and that is Saul. And now here, I just want to make a point, a bit of a theological point. And this is something that's very distinctive to Judaism in comparison to, Christianity to some regard, but especially more so with Islam. This is a God. The God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is a God you negotiate with, a God who co-creates with the people, is in dialogue with the people, is not some kind of slave driver dictator of some kind where the people have to obey no matter what. You have a lot of stories where there's a dialogue that takes place and the people can change God's mind. And that's really quite interesting. And this is very much, in the heart of Judaism. This is a God you have a relationship with, that you are in dialogue with, that you can negotiate with. It isn't a one-way street, a one-way affair of dictatorship. That you're just slaves of God to obey God. That's a very common concept in the Middle East. That was sort of what the Sumerians felt, and a lot of the Middle Eastern context here is that humans were simply the slaves of the gods, and the gods were your masters, and you obeyed them. End of story. All right. That was sort of the sentiment all around in the neighboring countries at this time period. So you'll have the similar story like with Abraham, and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, where the story is that these angels visit Abraham and they say they're going to destroy these cities because they're so evil and corrupt. And Abraham says, no, they can't be that bad. And so Abraham negotiates with God. If I can find 40 people that are good, will you then spare the city? And God will, okay. And then it goes on, oh, well, if I find 30, will you spare the city? Oh, okay. 20? Okay. 10? Okay. So Abraham thinks, oh, for sure, I'll find 10 good people in the city and the cities will be spared. Well, he couldn't find 10 people and they were destroyed. But that's just another example here of how things get negotiated with God. And it is kind of more dynamic, the relationship between the human and the divine. It is something more negotiable. They're like two partners working together to make things happen. It's humans have a very powerful role on this planet in their relationship to God, and also it's a lot of responsibility here. Okay, so it's really quite interesting. There's a lot of theological implications and consequences from this, but this is what comes through here. So that even later on in the rabbinic tradition, you'll have stories and sort of this image that there's God up there in heaven looking down at earth, and the rabbis are debating, did God mean this? Did God mean that? How do we interpret the Torah? It's all about how do we interpret the Torah. Yes, God spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai, and we have the holy book, the word of God. But how are we to understand it? How are we to interpret it? It could be open to many different interpretations. And so the rabbis, and a part of rabbinic training, all right, in the seminaries was to always be debating, exploring different possibilities and arguing those possibilities, so that the text is something to be debated. It is to be questioned in ways, not questioned if it comes from God, but questioned in terms of what's the best interpretation and application of the text. Okay. That is something that very much happens in the training and whatnot. So the story is that God is up there in heaven, and he looks down on earth, and the rabbis are debating and coming up with things, and God just kind of shakes his head. Boy, sort of, oh, those guys have kind of tricked me. They're so smart, those humans that I made, in terms of, the things that they come up with. All right. So it's quite interesting that this is sort of what comes through here in the Jewish tradition, and it has its history, its origins in these types of stories, that things are negotiable and debatable. All right. Yeah, it isn't this kind of black-white absolutism, never to be questioned type of thing. Okay. Anyways, to continue on here. So Saul becomes the first king. So we have kingship established here. And so generally the dates given for Saul is around 1045 to 1010 BC. And we have this conflict ongoing with the Philistines. So the next story that shows up here is with respect to David. And David was just a shepherd boy. He was a young kid who looked after the goats and the sheep out there. And he had brothers who were soldiers who were in battle. And so and as David always looked after the sheep, he was really good at the slingshot to keep away the lions. And lions were very predominant in the region at that time. They're not today anymore, but they were back then. And so he was really good at using that slingshot as his weapon of choice, right, for killing lions, chasing them off, or what have you. So the story is that one day his father says to David, listen, your brothers are held up at camp. There's, kind of a battle that's kind of stalled right now. I want you to go and bring them some food. So David goes to bring his brothers some food, and he goes there in the encampment and talks to his brothers who are soldiers and asking them, hey man, what's happening out there today? And they tell them, oh, those Philistines, man, they got this one guy there, Goliath. He's a giant, he's like 8 feet tall, and he's huge, and he's just cursing us and cursing our God, and challenging any of us to come and take us on it. None of us want to take him on. He's just such a giant. And David thinks, what? You gotta be kidding. How could this be? And he says, well, I'll take him on. So David goes out there, right, and with his little slingshot, he goes up to Goliath, and who is in full armor, and David refused to put on any armor. He just wanted his slingshot. And he basically gets him right in the forehead with a slingshot and brings him down. He falls down, Goliath, and then he chops off his head. Well, then the rest of the Israelite army sees this victory over Goliath, and they all go charging forward, and they win the battle. So through this, this is the whole story of David and Goliath, okay, where this little shepherd boy defeated this giant. And so he becomes a hero overnight. Well, to make a long story short, Saul becomes jealous of David because David is a hero, and a lot goes on here. But Saul then, really out of his jealousy, wants to get rid of David. Okay, he just becomes obsessed with jealousy over David, and David has to run for his life. And he's always on the run, and he could have killed Saul a few times, but he says, no, he has been anointed by God, officially brought into kingship by God. I will not kill such a person. And so what happens is through this, though, David also was a musician and a bit of a poet, and he composed various prayers and hymns. And these prayers and hymns, where he seeks God to protect him from always, Saul trying to kill him, and he's on the run. And he commits terrible sins, and he asks God for forgiveness. And he has all these different prayers, and also devotion to God and whatnot. They become very important later on for people's more individual, personal sense of relationship with God. And this material gets put into a book known as the Book of Psalms, okay, the Psalms of David, that often then will be, chanted, sung, prayed in synagogues, and even later Christian churches as well. They become very, very influential. So here, then eventually David does become king. Saul dies, and David becomes the next king of Israel. And under David, Israel becomes, at that time, the most powerful nation at that time. Okay, and he made Jerusalem to be the capital city, and gets the monarchy solidly established there. Now, what also then happens with David is that he also commits the most terrible sin before God. So the story is one day he's on his rooftop, in the palace rooftop, and he looks out and he sees, a few doors down, this beautiful woman who's having a bath in her courtyard, and it's Bathsheba. And he lusts after her, and he tells one of his servants to go and bring that woman to me. And the servant does, and they have sex. And the problem is that she was married, but he just falls in love with Bathsheba. Well, her husband was in the army. He was a soldier who was out in battle, and then he comes back one day from battle, and he finds out, and he's afraid actually. David's afraid that maybe Bathsheba's pregnant, okay, with from him. So the story is that as soon as the husband goes back, he thinks, oh, good, hopefully, he'll go with his wife and have sex with her, and she'll be pregnant, and he'll think it's his baby and not mine, and I'm going to be scot-free here. Well, what happens is that there right away is some kind of an uprising or conflict happening. And so his general comes and says, oh, David, we need to send some men right away out to battle because of this conflict that just developed. And so Bathsheba's husband right away says, oh, sir, I'm ready to go. Even though he just got back, he just was ready to leave right away. And David saying, no, you just stay here and be with your wife. You don't want to go now. You just got here. I'll send some other men. He's like, no, King David, I'm loyal to you. I want to go for battle and fight these people and da-da-da-da. And David tries to convince him not to go, but he can't. And so fine, he has to let this man go. And so now he knows he's in real trouble because he did not lie down with his wife. And so he will not get away with claiming, for the baby being regarded as being the husband's child, right? So what he does is he then tells his general that at the height of battle, make sure that Bathsheba's husband is at the front of the battle, and then pull back all the other soldiers to make sure he gets killed at battle. And so the general follows through on this command. And so the result is that David actually conspired to kill Bathsheba's husband in order to hide his own sin of having committed adultery, right? And he thinks he gets away with it. Well, what happens is there's a knock on the palace door, and it's a prophet. The prophet, I think it's Nathan, who says to him, God has seen what you have done, O David, the most terrible sin that you have committed, in really seeing Bathsheba's husband to put to death. And so anyway, to make, again, another long story short, David is just overtaken with guilt and remorse over what he did, seeking God's forgiveness for the terrible, terrible evil that he committed, right? So the thing is, so you have this story. So you have here in David, he becomes such a key figure in the history of the Jewish tradition, along with Moses and Abraham, okay, where he is the great hero who slew the giant Goliath on the one hand, but also the most terrible evil sinner who conspired the murder of, an innocent man to cover for his own sin of adultery. Right? So you've got this paradox in this one person, and how this one person, through their relationship with the God of Israel, right, seeking forgiveness, still being loved by God, but yet also being punished by God, because he did get punished in the sense that there'd be conflict, future conflict in the kingdom, and that happens with the kingdom splitting after Solomon. Okay, and Solomon is the son of David through Bathsheba. All this happens, but this is the power within the story here, is that David can so encapsulate, embody the human journey. He's like, potentially any and every human being. We each as individuals could be a great hero, have that potential to be this hero, but also to be the worst sinner, right? We have those capabilities within us, both of them within every one of us. And yet we can still have a relationship with God and no forgiveness of God, right? That's sort of the message here. So there's hope always for humanity, right? This is what's embodied. So, and again, this highlights another little theological point that's quite distinct here in Judaism, is that the people, the heroes in this journey of the Jewish story, they're not all perfect, sinless people. They all commit sins. Abraham sinned, Moses sinned, David sinned, and they are forgiven by God, and they are still used by God for his divine purposes. And that is to instill hope for every human being, is the hope of restoration, the hope of renewal, the hope of forgiveness. That's sort of what's meant. That's what gets theologically developed here, okay, in terms of the teachings and ideas through the history. Right? The history provides the basis for the theology that develops. Okay, the various beliefs about God are rooted in the historical experience of the people of Israel. So this is what's going on here. Okay, just so you know. All right. So what happens here then with David? Because David's very important in the Jewish tradition. We have another covenant, another contract that gets established with David. It's called the Davidic covenant. And the basis for that is in the second book of Samuel, in the prophet Samuel I talked about. Okay, there's the first book and the second book of Samuel. They're two books that have a lot of the history of this time period. In chapter 7, where God promises that the house of David will be, and his kingship will be established forever. And it's very brief, it's very simple, it's not fleshed out at this point. Okay, that the house of David, i.e., meaning a descendant of David, somehow the lineage of David, right, and the kingship of David, it will be somehow established forever. And this is what's going to become the basis for future messianic expectation, the coming of a Messiah. It is based and rooted in this Davidic contract, covenant, okay? Now, let me just kind of point out here. What does the word Messiah or Mashiach mean? The word Messiah, it refers to someone who is anointed, the anointed one. And that anointing was an actual ritual that was done on priests, prophets, and kings. Okay, those three, priests, prophets, and kings, they were all three would be anointed with oil because they were given a special position of authority and a special responsibility on behalf of God. Okay, they were sort of like, taking on a role, had a leadership role in some way on God's behalf, of as a prophet, as a messenger of God, as a priest, okay, in terms of doing the rituals for the sake of God, and as a king to provide the leadership over the people for the sake of God. Okay, so that's sort of the root meaning of Messiah, is the anointed one. And with it, it implies an appointment, a divine appointment, a divine position for divine purpose. Okay, some kind of a leadership role. All right, so hopefully that makes sense to you guys. All right, so this is why David is important on a number of points here. He solidly establishes the nation of Israel at this time, making it very wealthy and prosperous and powerful, number one. Number two, he establishes Jerusalem as the capital. Okay, number two, right? Number three, the covenant that gets established through him is key. And then the Psalms, the Psalms of David, a collection of books, or a book that, that has various his prayers all in there and things like that. And the whole story around him as being this great hero and also sinner, and how that is so central to people understanding the human journey, the human relationship with God. So after David, we have Solomon. Solomon, as I mentioned, is the son of David and Bathsheba, who becomes the next king. As you can see here, ruled from 970 to 930 BC. And so what's associated with him is that, the tradition is he's very much known for his wisdom. And so there are also books associated that become a part of the Bible that's associated with him. The book of Proverbs, these are sayings of wisdom, and the Song of Solomon. Okay, these are sort of the books associated with him. Now, he inherited a very wealthy nation. And so he then engages in a massive building campaign of palaces, royal stables, and the temple in Jerusalem. He's the one that builds the first temple in Jerusalem. Okay. And so it becomes something permanent. And so very lavishly done with gold and whatnot. So there was a lot involved here. And he also, in terms of the palaces and whatnot, the tradition has it is that he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. So there were a lot of women here involved, and that's why there was such a massive need for building of palaces to care for all these women. And of course, he had a love for Arabian horses, and there definitely is historical evidence of Arabian horses being brought into the area. That's sort of where we get the beginnings of all that. And, you have that whole story of the Queen of Sheba. She was the Arab queen who visited Solomon. That's very likely. There seems to be historical support for that. So what happens, though, is in all of this, he then, raises the taxes, and they go up and up and up. And he finds that, he's overextended himself. And so then he had to force the people to do labor for nothing, forced labor on top of high taxes, to deal with and complete his massive building campaign. Well, what happens after his death, his death and his son was to rule, is a rebellion breaks out, and people were very not happy at all with Solomon's kingship, and so a split occurs. Oops. And so we have the split here then between, and this happens in 922, the kingdom of Judah in the south and the kingdom of Israel to the north. Okay. And so, a revolt against Solomon's son by 10 tribes, the 10 tribes of Israel. Remember, there's the 12 tribes of Israel, where these are all the descendants of the 12 sons of of Jacob. Okay. And so the two tribes, they then stayed in the south, with Jerusalem being the capital city, and that's known as the kingdom of Judah. And that's where we get the word Judaism from, and eventually the word Jew comes from that, okay? Then the other 10 tribes, the majority, they make up the northern kingdom of Israel, and they establish their capital city at Samaria. Okay, and you can kind of see the stars there on the map. Okay. So we have this major split happening. Well, whoops, where am I here? I'm going wrong, I'm going backwards. Okay. Well, what happens next here, and again, I'm doing a lot of history right now, right? Obviously, is that the Assyrians come to power. They rise to power. This is a whole new, they just arise as a kingdom and as a nation and start to dominate the whole region. Okay. And they conquer the northern kingdom of Israel, conquering the city of Samaria in the year 721 BC. Right, and they establish, as you can see here, a bit of a map as to how that spread out the Assyrian Empire. And they were pretty, well, mind you, when you look out history, ruthless warriors and kingdoms were established. I mean, it's just unbelievable compared to how we live today, how people were slaughtered, skinned alive, all kinds of things. the Assyrians were very much feared. They were very fierce warriors. And what they did, their policy was when they conquered a certain area, they displaced people. They mixed up the populations from one area to another, okay, in order to destabilize the region. So when people are exiled and taken out of one region and taken into another where, they don't know anybody, they've got to start to build a home from scratch and, and just kind of basically just try to survive in a new region, and people are mixed from one region to another, it destabilizes them. And then it's easier for the Assyrians to maintain their power and their control over all the vast territory they just conquered. And that's what they did. So the people of the northern kingdom, they'll become known later on as the lost tribes of Israel, because of this sort of mixing of races and populations that take place. And so later on, the people of this northern area, they're going to become known as the Samaritans, and you'll find them referred to like in the New Testament. And they'll end up being very much despised and seen as not being pure, true Jews by the people of the south, who are going to become known as the Jews. Okay, and this is what's going to happen later on. Okay, just so you know. So that's the Assyrians. They weren't able to capture Jerusalem, or the southern kingdom. They wanted to, but they weren't able to. Well, then the Assyrians, they fall, and the Babylonians have overtaken them. So we have the Babylonians rising to power and the Babylonian kingdom getting established. And the Babylonians, they indeed did conquer the southern kingdom of Judah and captured Jerusalem, and they destroyed the temple. Okay, and they took around several thousand people from that area of Jerusalem, mostly of the upper classes, the royal class, those who have higher levels of expertise and skill set, and the educated, the upper classes. They exiled them. They took them out of Jerusalem and took them into other regions of Babylonia at that time. All right, many going into the city of Babylon and elsewhere. Now, the thing is, though, is they left the city of Jerusalem empty. And this is where they're different from the Assyrians. And this then allowed for the possibility that someday those people of Judah, all right, or we'll call them Jews here now, okay, they could perhaps someday return to Jerusalem and rebuild the city and rebuild the temple, and once again, be there in their homeland. So this is, and that's what's actually going to happen. Okay, so hopefully you get that. So this is referred to as the Babylonian exile in 586 BC, when the people of Judah are taken out of Jerusalem and taken into other areas of Babylon. Okay. Oh, and here, this picture. And so, in Babylon, here we have, it's one of the wonders of the world. The 7 wonders of the world are the hanging gardens in the city. That was really amazing what they had there developed in this empire. Okay, where am I here? So now, this is a very important event. We have major changes happening, because up to this point, in terms of the religion of ancient Israel, as you can see here on the left, what were some of the key elements here? Thinking of the covenants established through Abraham, David, and Moses. Okay, on the left, it's sort of like, think of it like a column here on the left. Through Abraham, there's the promised land. Okay, the land that was promised to Abraham by God, that this is going to be your land. There's going to be a future nation and kingdom here with people and whatnot, right? And then through Moses, you get all of these laws established, right? You get the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And with those laws and whatnot, they built the temple in Jerusalem. They have their priests, their rituals, their holy days, and that this is going to be central to their religion. Okay. And then the third contract or covenant is established with David, and that's the kingship of David, that is to be established forever. And those are sort of the fundamental key things that are at the heart of the religion of ancient Israel at this time period. But now, here they are, they no longer have their promised land. It got overtaken by the Babylonians. They no longer are under the kingship of David or any king. Okay, they no longer have their temple with their priests and rituals that they can do. So they now find themselves in exile in a foreign land, but they have a promise and hope of someday returning. Okay. And instead of the king being their leader and guide, along with the priests who run the temple, they now, and this is where it's held, that the scriptures start to really get preserved here, get put together. That's going to become the basis of the Bible. Okay. And so they hold that the Torah is going to be their guide. And instead of priests being their leaders, it is the scholars, the scribes who are going to be their leaders. Later on, they're going to be known as the rabbis, okay, who will provide that leadership role instead of priests. Okay. And then instead of meeting at a temple and going to the city of Jerusalem to the temple for various holy days, the people would meet in their homes and in places that they could perhaps build, where we have the beginnings of what becomes known as the synagogue. Okay. And the synagogue is a place for prayer, worship, and study. And that the people then would make it a part of their religion, that they keep the day, seventh day of the week as a day of rest, the Sabbath. They would keep their dietary laws. They would go through all the different life cycle rituals of circumcision and their distinct marriage and death rituals and what have you. Okay. And followed their own laws in various ways. And that's kind of how they retained their own distinctive Jewish religious identity. Okay. And so this is what starts to develop here during this time of exile, are these elements, and they will become very dominant later on after a second destruction of the temple under the Romans. All right. But it kind of begins here. It all makes sense once we go through everything, and it's probably good to watch these videos twice. Okay. There's a lot in here. Okay. So what happens next, okay, again, going through, like a couple thousand years of history here, okay, quickly, is the Persian kingdom overthrows the Babylonians. Okay, so we always have one kingdom taking over another one, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, and then later the Greeks, and then the Romans, okay, but we've got one after another. And so here, this happens in 539 BC, and where the Persians, under the kingship of Cyrus, who comes to take over this region of Jerusalem or Judah, okay, that area, he grants the Jews the right to return to their homeland and allows them to build the temple in the year 538 BC. And not only that, but he also provided the funding, drawing from his own royal treasury, all right, to have the funds to rebuild their temple in the city of Jerusalem. And this is amazing. And so I'm going to talk about this more later, but this is seen as a fulfillment of prophecy, right? That he was like an anointed one, a type of messianic figure, King Cyrus, who was used by God to fulfill promises that God made through the prophets that someday the people will return to Jerusalem. Okay. Again, I'll talk more about that later. So this is a big event in Jewish history, is the return of the exiles. Those who had been exiled, into Babylon are now returning to Jerusalem. And here the books in the Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah, describe these events of their return, the rebuilding of the temple, and where the people come together to renew the contract, renew the covenant that they made with God. And under the Persians, Judah now becomes a city-state. Basically, they had a lot of freedom. They could kind of run their own affairs, but largely ruled by the high priest, but under Persian administration. So they'd have to pay their taxes to the Persians, right? But basically, they had their freedom of religion and could basically run their own affairs as long as they paid their taxes and didn't try to create a revolt. Okay, but things were pretty good. The Persians were always a very tolerant type of rulership compared to others. Okay. Well, then eventually the Persians get overthrown by the Greeks. Alexander the Great in 332 BC. He then overthrows the Persians and becomes dominant, establishing the Greek Empire here. And so initially for the Jews, again, so we're no longer under Persian administration, but Greek administration. And basically it was the same, since they had freedom of religion and could look after their own affairs under the leadership of the high priest. However, it started to change, all right? When we come into it, you can see here, what's going to kick off is a revolt in 167 BC, where under the leadership of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who was a king, again, still under kind of Greek rule, but the Hellenistic Empire, the Greek Empire, became quite huge. And so different dynasties kind of ruled over different regions in a sense. And so he was of the Seleucid dynasty as king who ruled over the area of Judea. And he was afraid that the Jews were going to instigate a revolt, that there was a possibility of a revolt occurring. And so he then implemented the policy of Hellenization, that is to enforce Greek religion on all the people. And so he then outlawed Judaism. And so the Jews were supposed to burn their scriptures publicly. They weren't allowed to keep the Sabbath. They were to violate the dietary laws. They were had to eat pork, just everything to totally go against the religion and force Greek religion, so to speak, on them. And the lynch thing is that he took a pig and had it sacrificed to the Greek god Zeus in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. That just did it. And so this kicked off then a revolt led by the high priest. Okay, Judah the Maccabee was his name, and he and his sons led a revolt, and it became known as the Maccabean Revolt that went on for a few years, from 167 to 164 BC. And amazingly, this little Jewish state under the leadership of the priests won the revolt. Okay, they gained their independence from Greek rule. And this is then celebrated in the Jewish holy day of Hanukkah, known as the Festival of Lights. And so the story here is that they were under siege. Okay, the Jews were under siege by the Greeks here. And in the temple, there was very little, just like a few drops of oil left that would only last maybe for one day to keep the light in the temple going, like one of the candles or flames. In the Jewish, the menorah, normally it's a 7-branched candlestick that represents the 7 days of the week, right? So anyways, there was just enough oil just to keep one going, or the light going for just, just a few days. I forget now how long. But to make a long story short, it was held that a miracle happened, that this oil kept burning for a full 8 days until some oil could be gotten when the siege kind of, got overtaken or ended. So they managed to get the oil that they needed. So to celebrate this event, that's why it's become known as the Festival of Lights, is they'll have the one main candle, and on each day, 8 days in a row, they will light a candle on each day to commemorate these 8 days that this miracle happened, that the light and this fire kept going on in the temple during this time when it should have burnt out. It was deemed to be a miracle. So, but it is, again, to celebrate that they gained their freedom and independence from the Greeks at this time, when the Greeks literally defiled the temple, made it impure, because pork, and I'm sure you guys know, is an unclean animal. You're not to eat pork. To sacrifice a pig is the worst thing you could possibly do in the temple in honor of a foreign god, and it's like the worst thing that could happen. Okay, so this is Hanukkah. That we'll talk about the holy days later on. So they're under Greek rule. So they gained their independence. All right, from the Greeks. They were an independent city-state in Jerusalem for about 100 years. All right, until the Romans established the Roman Empire, and they overtake this area of Judea in the year 63 BC. Okay, the Roman general Pompeo. And so at this time, they appointed Herod to be the king, who was Jewish, but appointed by the Romans to rule over Judea. So it's sort of like, okay, we want to keep the peace here. And basically, the Romans allowed the Jews the freedom of their religion, because they knew that, boy, they'd rather die than compromise their religion. However, they had, paid taxes to the Romans. But, and here to the right is a bit of a picture of what the temple would have looked like under King Herod. He did a major refurbishing of the temple at that time. Now, the people, though, had become now increasingly resentful over always being under a foreign rulership of one kind or another, and now especially of the Romans and all the taxes they had to pay. And there was increasing expectancy of the coming of a Messiah, someone who would be anointed by God to lead the people, right, to free them from the oppressors and bring them to freedom, full freedom in their own promised land, which would be known as Israel, right? And that would again establish that complete freedom of foreign rule, that the Messiah would come and do this. And it was expected it was going to happen through battle. Okay, that was the belief of amongst many at the time. So what happens is a revolt, increasingly people are restless, and a revolt does kick off in the year 66 CE, in the Common Era. So this is now after the time of Jesus, okay, after the beginnings of Christianity. Jesus was in the midst of this time period, and we'll look at all that later, but just so you have that in mind, that this is now after the very beginnings of Christianity. Jesus being crucified is held probably around the year 30 CE. Okay, so this all takes place afterwards. So what happens is there's a revolt that takes place beginning in the year 66. The Romans destroyed the temple. The zealots were those who they were eager to take up arms for the sake of freedom of Israel. Okay, and that's where we get the word zealot from, is from their zeal. Jews who were very zealous about establishing their freedom through military might and effort at that time under the Romans. Okay, they became known as the zealots. And that's where we get the word zealot from, that we apply to people who are very zealous. Okay. Anyway, so the temple gets destroyed, Jerusalem gets destroyed, and the last remaining zealots, they held out at a fort known as Masada, and you can see that on the picture here. It was at a mountaintop where they had built a fort. It was built a bit earlier than this, and they held out there for some time, until the Romans had so surrounded them, they had no hope of making it, that they then just all committed suicide and killed themselves before they would give themselves over to capture by the Romans. So that, yeah, they've made movies out of that, all this. Anyway, well then, there was a second revolt that happened in the year 132 to 135 CE in the Common Era, led by a figure named Bar Kokhba, who claimed to be the Messiah, and that indeed he would, through his leadership, overthrow the Romans and set them free from all this oppression. And the Romans absolutely were so fed up with the Jews, they literally totally destroyed everything. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed. All the settlements and villages and everything were destroyed. Judea became depopulated, and the Jews also were not allowed to even enter Jerusalem, even though it was destroyed, and the Romans would rebuild it some, but they weren't even allowed to enter in that area. And so that resulted in what's often referred to as the Great Diaspora, where the Jews from then on were dispersed away from Judea largely. They were destroyed and devastated in its profound way, many moving into parts of North Africa, the rest into the Middle East, some into Europe. Okay, and wherever they went, they were then led by the scriptures themselves, the Torah, and the leadership of the rabbis, seeking to live a holy life, following the laws as best as they could, as a nation exile, in a state of exile, expecting a future return to Jerusalem, all right, to the promised land, once again under the leadership of the Messiah that they expected to come. Okay, now we'll go through more of that later, and but I think I will just end this for today. Okay, that's quite a bit of material, but that's the history. And so next one, I'll go into some of the beliefs that developed during this time period, and we'll pick it all up from there. Okay, all right, good.